I want to record my lecture on economic globalization. Let me apologize because I am using last course slides. I could not update them on time, sorry. Anyway, this is 2020-21 and it's topic 5, economic globalization. My talk will mostly focus on a couple of theoretical debates and 3 illustrations or case studies. The main theoretical debates have to do with the impact of globalization on prosperity, as well as on the potential of finance and other global economic spheres to underpin equilibrium, aid equilibrium, or to underpin equilibrium or provoke disruption. The 3 case studies are global value chains, pluriscalar innovation systems, and financialization. Let me start by reminding you of 3 social changes that unleashed the current wave of economic globalization. It's not the first one. There has been some sort of economic globalization before. It was in the 16th century when Spain and Portugal colonized America, and Portugal started to trade with Asia, with the Far East. There was also a sort of economic globalization in the 18th century where many European merchants traded with slaves from Africa to America. And the history of globalization is long, and it's not a linear one, it's a complex one. So I don't mean that we are just starting from scratch. I want to highlight 3 important processes, changes that actually triggered economic globalization since the 1980s. The first one has to do with policy. In the 1980s, the governments of the US and the UK, respectively led by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, liberalized finance and endorsed the so-called Washington Consensus. So their philosophy basically was that markets work and governments have to lift markets and private companies to do what they think is the best strategy. And they claimed that all governments of the world should do that because there was no alternative. So they stood for privatizing public companies, liberalizing financial markets, liberalizing labor markets, opening economies to international trade, establishing completely independent central banks, and so on, and so on, and so on. The second set, and we will look at the second set of changes through the COF index, which is linked to your mother room and clearly records an increase in political, economic, and cultural globalization of all the countries of the world since the 1970s or past the 1980s. And finally, we have an exponential growth of financial assets. The volume of the stock markets nowadays is a very new phenomenon. It has not been compared, the volume of financial markets compared to the real economy has not been so disproportionate as it is now. Before. It was not like that. There were stock markets in the 17th century, but they were not so huge as they are now. The first theoretical debate has to do with the consequences of economic globalization for prosperity. A number of economists claim that stand for an affirmative answer to this question to the extent that economic globalization creates a global market where all economies can get the most out of their competitive advantages in international trade. They can specialize on the activities they do the best. Um, Other economists complement this point, claiming that endogenous factors of growth actually endow economies with a better or a worse position in this global market. And these endogenous factors have to do with human capital, innovation, and knowledge mostly. In contrast, other authors claim that globalization triggers divisive mechanisms. For instance, David Harvey observes that economic globalization, has favored accumulation by dispossession. That means that a few wealthy financial powers are able to seize the land, the knowledge, and the cities, and many data of many people, and can very big businesses on these grounds. They can become the owners of many things that other people can no longer control. Thomas Piketty has, in a similar vein, has argued that the revenues of capital are clearly bigger than the revenues of the average economic growth. So the small fraction of very wealthy people can increase their wealth at a much rapid rate than the average citizen. That's a very strong social divide. Finally, Saskia Sassen has argued that many large groups of populations are being expulsed from the core of the world economy. She means that people who live in some areas where the environmental resources have been exploited, but she also means European youth. So the rest, it's not. In her view, expulsions are not so obvious as they can be in some cases where you can see people leaving the place. The second theoretical issue has to do with the potential of the economic globalization to restore equilibrium after disruption. That's particularly important after the Great Recession. It was particularly important after the Great Recession in 2008. The orthodox mainstream argument in economics states that finance self-balances through markets, because finance is a market itself, where supply meets demand, and they find an point of equilibrium. Economist Joseph Stiglitz has warned that economic globalization is not working correctly because of distorted incentives. However, he thinks that if these distorted incentives were corrected, then we could see economic globalization working. By distorted incentives, he means short-term financial management and too long intellectual property right. So that's changing these laws would actually warranty that the global market is really working. In contrast, other argues claim that this is not the case, not at all. Economic finance is not self-balancing. It may be disrupting, and global value chains may be too. Even innovation must be disrupting, because they claim that eventually the effects of economic phenomena on people's life depend on regulation. They are not created from scratch, but they are embedded in social institutions, and the thing depends on the many effects depend on how these institutions are designed, are reformed, or are maintained. Well, he claims that after 2008 financial regulation was, after 2008 financial regulation was a big issue everywhere in the world. Could the governments get their money back? They had bailed out the banks, but could they get their money back? Was it possible to have another financial system after that huge setback? Many reforms were enacted, many new laws were drafted, many discussions were open, and there were some changes. However, Silvia Wolby claims that that regulation and other similar ones are not an outcome of fair play. They are an outcome of an even strategic interaction at national and global scales, where different actors play different roles and are endowed with very different instruments to influence other actors, where political and economic political globalization intermingles with economic globalization. We will discuss this kind of phenomena when we think about the vaccine for COVID or about the role of video conference software for education in lockdown, in a time of lockdowns and self-distanciation. I will stop here and then I will record another short video, another short audio on the examples, because I am not sure if the system is really working. Sorry.